Hi guys, it's Coach Anthony back at you with another edition of Animate, bringing chess to life. Continuing with our Meet the Team series, next on stage is the Knight, a member of the short range family. The Knight is the fifth most powerful piece of the team. The horsey is rather special as it's the only piece that can jump over other pieces. Let's examine its movements. The Knight, or as I like to call it, the horsey, moves in a weird way, and that is it moves in an L shape, which looks like this. So the Knight can move 1, 2, and then it can go to the side, which looks like a L in reverse. So the Knight, as we let these arrows show, moves in an L shape. But when you actually move the Knight, you just pick it up and land it an L shape away like this. Some people like to move it like a gear stick and they sort of bring it down in an L shape. However you choose to move it is not really that important. The key thing is that it moves an L shape away. So the Knight can move to more than one L shape. So let's identify another L shape. So we've got an L shape where it can move 1, 2 forward and 1 to the side. So we have another L shape. And as we've said before, the key is if you're going to either move to any of the L shapes that you just pick up the Knight and land it on the square. So an L shape away from the square E4 is F6. So we just pick it up from E4 and land it on F6. Now there are many more L shapes here. The question is, can you work out how many L shapes there are? So as you know by now, pause the video and we'll be back to check shortly. Hopefully you have paused the video and we're going to check the answer. So let's have a look. I'm going to highlight the different squares. So as we saw before, D2 was definitely a square. Well done if you found F2. Excellent if you found G3. Hopefully you did find G5, F6, D6, C5, and finally C3. So each one of these squares highlighted is a potential square the Knight can go to. So we see the Knight is a very tricky piece. So it's one you have to be very careful. But the best way I like to look at it is, it usually has 4 squares going forward like this, and 4 squares going backwards, giving us a total of 8 squares. Okay guys, to demonstrate the power of the Knight, we've drafted in, once again, those little guys, those minions, those pawns. And hopefully you've used your keen eye and you've realized that the pawns are not in their best position, which is side by side. As a quick recap, we know that pawns are weak from the side and from the back, but it's very interesting to see the way the Knight takes advantage of this situation. Now, the Knight has how many squares it can go forward? You remembered, excellent. 4 squares forward, 4 squares backwards. The key question is, which one of the squares going forward would be the most effective square, the most useful square for the Knight to land on? Hopefully you found Knight to F6. And as we can see, when the knight lands on f6, it attacks the pawn on d7 and the pawn on h7, leaving the black team with a difficult choice. Basically, which little guy is going to get it? Well, the little guy on the h file decides to make a run for it. And we notice pawns usually can move 1 or 2 squares on their starting rank. But we see that the knight was nicely placed on f6 because it prevented that pawn from moving 2 squares forward. Well, the next move is a no-brainer. We simply gobble up the pawn on d7 and leave the black team to find out what they really want to do. Okay, the f-file pawn has made a run for it. Now, question, where could we go to possibly block the pawn on h6? Hopefully, you've noticed the L shape. We move backwards in the L shape and we land on the square f6, which nicely blocks the pawn along the h file. So the black team decide to make a run for it. So we see that the pawn on f4 would desperately like to make it down to f1 where it can get promotion. The question is, how are we going to stop it using the knight? We've definitely blocked the pawn on the h file because it can't pass through the square h5, or else the knight will pounce. Well, excellent if you saw the move knight to g4. Well, what does this do? Well, we see the knight is able to attack the pawn on h6 and also keep an eye on the square f2, which the pawn on f4 has to pass in order to get promotion. Very sneaky. The black team decides to attack the knight, and what we might notice here is the knight is not looking so great, because as it gets closer to the side of the board, it has less squares available for it to go to. We saw when the knight was in the middle of the board at the start of the video, it had 8 squares it can go to, but all of a sudden it's quite limited at the moment. It's only got 6 squares to go to. Well, a lovely move. Hopefully you're getting the idea that knights are able to block pawns pretty well. So now what we've done is block the pawn on the f file. So now that pawn hasn't got a hope of ever landing on f1 because we're blocking it. And we're also keeping an eye on an important square, and that is the square h3, which again, if the pawn on the h file wants to pass, it has to go through that square. Very clever. So the f pawn decides to make a move, and again what we can see here is how the knight is limited only to 6 squares as it gets closer and closer to the edge of the board. Wonderful move by the white team and the knight here. By hopping to the square h3, it unblocks the pawn, but also still keeps an eye on the f2 square. So unfortunately, the f pawn just really can't go anywhere, which actually leaves only really one move, which is pawn to h4. So hopefully you can guess what will be a lovely square for the knight to land on, and that is f2, where once again that f pawn is completely blocked, and the knight also keeps an eye on the square h3. Now there's only one move for black to make, and it will worsen the position. So hopefully you remember what we call that. Excellent. That is zugzwang. So having no choice, the pawn has to meet a grisly end. So dinner time once again. Only one move left. And we finish. Excellent work by the knight. Arise, Sir Knight. Okay guys, we're going to take a closer look at some of the knight's weaknesses. And in order to do that, we've drafted in those little guys again. But this time round, the little guys may be a bit more successful than they have been in previous videos. One of the first things we hope that you've drawn your attention to are those green squares surrounding the knight. Now we see the knight is on the edge of the board, and we see that the number of squares that the knight can go to has drastically reduced. We are now talking only 3 squares. So there's a saying, a knight on the rim is dim, simply because it has less squares it can go to. Well, the knight is trying to stop 2 of those little guys on opposite sides of the board. Now, hopefully you remember that the knight is a short range piece, so we're going to see one of its weaknesses really showing up. So we have to stop those little guys. Best thing to do, let's try and head towards the center of the board. Why? Well, then it gives us more chance of getting to either side of the board. But as we can see, and this is a little bit of a recap for you guys, the knight has 4 squares forward at present, but unfortunately none of those squares tend to aim at the C file, B file and A file, which is over the other side of the board, which is why the knight is a short range piece. So I guess the best thing is to try to go to the middle of the board. Well, our little guy makes a run for it and says, well, come and get me if you can. The knight obliges and we hop towards that little guy. But then all of a sudden, the other little guy says, over here. Where do we go? Do we go to the left side of the board? Do we go to the right side of the board? Decisions. The knight decides to try to keep an eye on the A3 square, which, as we can see, the pawn must pass through. However, we see the little guy on the other side of the board make a run for it too. Wow. How are we going to keep an eye on any of the following squares? Very tough. Well, the knight decides to try to at least remain close to the H file pawn, but I guess by now you know what's going to happen. That's correct. The A file pawn makes a run for it, and now as the pawns get closer and closer towards the edge of the board, then the knight actually has to sit on the side of the board. And as we said earlier, a knight on the rim is dim, so wow, there's not many squares for us to go to. Desperately trying to keep an eye on the H2 pawn. However, unfortunately, because the knight is a short range piece and it can't get to either side of the board as quickly, the pawns take full advantage of that by first of all tying the knight down. So if the knight tries to escape anywhere, well then the pawn on the H file is threatening to march on its merry way and before long achieve its goal of promotion. Well, the knight shuts that off, but unfortunately, as we know, the other side of the board, here comes the little guy, A for Coach Anthony. Right, so that's the A pawn running for it. The knight still keeps an eye on the H2 pawn, but as we can see, just not good enough. A2 pawn is going to make it. And there we have promotion, and a promotion into a queen. And unfortunately for the knight, there's just no hope in this situation, because once the knight moves out of the way, the queen is going to assist the other little guy. Just so we get an idea of what can happen, can just assist the other little guy to making a new queen. So say for example, queen to f1 attacking the knight. The knight's got to do something. Tries to block and attack the queen at the same time. But unfortunately, now the knight is just completely trapped. If we look at all the squares that the knight could possibly go to, the queen has them covered. The next move, the knight will be a goner, and the other pawn will also get promoted. So in summary, the knight moves in an L shape. It is a member of the short range family. The horsey loves the middle of the board and hates the edges of the board. The knight is indeed a very tricky customer. Okay guys, please like and subscribe, and see you all on the next video.